Hi, I'm Reverend Kim Polchow from Marshfield United Methodist Church and the Streams MUMC, here today to talk about King David in this episode, episode 3 of the United Monarchy. We're going to talk about David as a king, a hero, and as a legend. And as we start into David, I want us to pause and remember what we might know about another legendary king, King Arthur of Britain. So if you know about King Arthur, you might start thinking about what you know about King Arthur. I will briefly go through some of what I know about King Arthur, who caught my fascination when I was in college. Arthur has this great story. He's a Welsh king, fights off the Saxons. He comes from he's a weird backstory, but from some humble origins, and his brothers get passed over in order for Arthur to become Arthur Pendragon, the king of Britain. And he unites Britain in this fabulous way. Of course, he does all of this by this sort of wonderful feat of pulling the sword from the stone, the sword Excalibur. And then he's raised up and gains direction by Merlin, who sort of made this sword from the stone thing take place. You might remember that Arthur ruled from a round table where he had his knights around him, and everyone had a voice. So he was sort of this new paragon of a just ruler in the West. He was beloved by his knights, and he really put England on the map. He may even have been the king who presided over this transfer of England from more of a pagan or Druid culture to a Christian culture. We see that in the start of the story. Of course, there is this magician, Merlin. It's a little bit fantastical. And by the end of the story, what are his knights out searching for? The Holy Grail, the cup that Jesus used at the Last Supper. So there's sort of this change from in the religiosity, what kind of religion the kingdom has under Arthur's rule. Of course, there's this moment in Arthur's rule where everything sort of starts to turn, the beginning of the end, and it is an act of infidelity, probably not on Arthur's part, although there are some versions of the story that suggests that maybe there was an act of incest with his sister. But there is the issue of Guinevere and Lancelot in the later and the French versions of the story where Guinevere is unfaithful to Arthur. And that's the beginning of the end for Arthur. Everything starts to sort of slide downhill. He loses favor. People scatter. Doesn't do so well in battles. He has an issue with his children, which is, does he have any children? There's a conception issue. And he is sort of constantly in the presence of Merlin. You know, Merlin keeps kind of popping up as an advisor in the story until Merlin dies. Merlin does appear after death in this sort of miraculous appearance and helps him at a crucial moment. As his empire disintegrates, he is challenged by Mordred, who is either his nephew or his son by his sister Morgane. And then that is the battle that ends up claiming Arthur's life and Mordred's life. And of course, Arthur is often called the once and future king because he disappears into the Isle of Avalon, and the people of Britain hope that he would someday return, which is pretty messianic. So that's kind of a low-key wrap-up of King Arthur's story. And now let's take a look at King David's story. David enters the scene already. We've seen David in the last episode. David appears and is anointed by Samuel while Saul is king. But of course, God's favor has turned from Saul, and God has identified David as the upcoming king. So Samuel goes and anoints him in 1 Samuel 16, 1-13. Then David ends up becoming Saul's pet musician who soothes away the troubled spirit God has sent on Saul, and his armor bearer. And then, of course, David turns around in the next chapter, chapter 17, and fights Goliath. Oddly, though, and if you feel like looking this up, there are 3 verses in the Bible that talk about who killed Goliath, and they don't all give the same answer. Now, when you go to read these, you may need to look at the footnotes to find out what words may have been added or taken away to make them read this way. After this time, when David is in Saul's court, David ends up getting threatened by Saul, who keeps throwing random spears at him in the household. Of course, David is married to one of Saul's daughters, Michal, by this point. David ends up running away, and David becomes an outlaw. This is, I think, one of the most interesting things about David's story, because how this guy would ever become the king that united them all is a little wild, considering the outlawing that he's done. So he works for the Philistines, for the king of Gath, and he goes out and he runs missions against the Canaanites in the area. But there's something really odd here. The Philistines think that he is running these missions against his own people, which wins him some odd favor. And David is taking the spoils of these attacks and he is sending them back to Judah. So he's already taking care of Judah, and he's sort of shoring up goodwill for the future, even though he's acting as a renegade. He's sort of like a Robin Hood-ish figure here, like a lovable rogue. After the death of both Saul and Jonathan, David truly becomes king. First, he becomes king of Judah. So Saul's son becomes the king of Israel, and Judah secedes from Israel and becomes its own thing. 10 tribes in the north, 2 tribes in the south. The 2 tribes in the south are Judah. They secede and they set up what they call the House of David. They set up David as their king, and they name his line as their future kingship line. Ishbaal, which is Saul's son, is the king of Israel in the north. And David then works to consolidate his power. He gains power through marriage, for example, to Abigail, which is the story I referenced last time when I said it was one of the having men for dinner pattern stories. And he is successful in pushing back the Philistines. It's easier for him because he has relationships with them and experience of their military, of course. So he's very successful in pushing back the Philistines. After the deaths of Ishbaal and Abner, now let's stop and talk about Ishbaal as a name. Baal was the name of a Canaanite god. Ish, like Ishtar. Oh my goodness, this is a very, very Canaanite name. So after the deaths of Ishbaal, the king of the north, who cannot believe I just said the king in the north, after the death of Ishbaal and Abner, then David becomes king of both because Israel wants Judah's king for their own. That ends the civil war, and David moves his seat of leadership to a town called Jerusalem, which he fortifies and makes into a great city, and it becomes known as the city of David, right? Bethlehem is the town of David, and Jerusalem is the city of David. It is very much David's town. He sets it up as his capital. And once he is in charge of both Israel in the north and Judah in the south, there are very few external threats. While David is faithful to God and leading God's people in Israel and Judah in a faithful way, everything is very quiet on the foreign fronts. But of course, whatever rises must fall. And a couple of things happen to really bring David down. One of them is the rape of Tamar, his daughter. Now, David is not the rapist. His son Amnon is. This is a very interesting story to read because Amnon lusts after his brother's Absalom's sister, Tamar, who we would know is his half-sister, but that's the reference the Bible makes. It doesn't cover up that Amnon basically rapes his half-sister. He doesn't just rape her, he rapes her and then he hates her. It's a very sad story. And this results in the belated death of Amnon at Absalom's hand. And then Absalom separates himself and all of this drama ensues about Absalom and whether he can come back, whether David will see him, this sort of thing. It really, really tears the family apart. Absalom will then come back into the kingdom and then work his ways in the military, and suddenly he's leading a revolt against David. Absalom ends up dying, even though David has asked his commanders to protect him. It becomes a big mess. The other thing that works to really bring David down is the Bathsheba and the Uriah incident. Now, this story is really hard for 21st century hearers because we now ask about things like consent and we look at power relations. Can a woman who is the subject of a king actually consent to be unfaithful to her husband with him, or was it something else entirely? It's a very disturbing story. Basically, David sees Bathsheba purifying herself after her monthly time, and he wants her, and so he takes her. He realizes that her husband is Uriah the Hittite. You remember back to the very first episode, we talked about the Hittites and the Egyptians and the Hittites who were in northern Israel. So she is married to Uriah the Hittite, and Uriah is fighting for David. David finds out that Bathsheba is pregnant. And of course, there is no wonder if this child is his, because Uriah, her husband, has been off fighting, and because we know when David slept with her, and it was after her last period. So David is the father of Bathsheba's child. David seeks to cover this up. So he sends for Uriah, and he wants Uriah to come home and sleep with his wife. And that way, it will look like Uriah could possibly be the father of Bathsheba's child, which would make sense, right? Because that's his wife. Uriah, filled with honor, refuses to sleep with his wife. When his men are in battle and they're uncomfortable, he's not going to take the comfort of his wife. David tries to get him drunk. Uriah still won't go in his house. So Uriah goes back to the fight with his new orders in his hand. And the new orders are to put Uriah on the front line so that he will surely die. And if he doesn't die, for all of the men to desert him so that he's left alone and absolutely will die. David has just signed the death warrant for the man who was married to the woman he took. And this all comes out in a story that Nathan brings to him. Nathan is sort of like the replacement for Samuel. He's a prophet who advises David, and he comes to David and tells him this story about a rich man who took a poor man's only sheep. David is incensed. He becomes convicted of his sin, and he sits in punishment of himself while his child is born to Bathsheba and then dies. When the child dies, David rises from his mourning and he goes back to work. And he keeps Bathsheba as his wife. She will become the mother of Solomon. The other issue in David's downfall that I think is very interesting is this woman named Abishag. I don't know how to pronounce her name in a way that doesn't just sound really harsh. Abishag is a young virgin who is brought to David in his old age and put in his bed to warm him. Although the Bible is very clear that David does not have sexual relations with her, she becomes like a symbol of his impotence. And then there becomes a whole issue with his sons over who is going to marry the beautiful Abishag, who has been warming their dad's bed. This was not written in the 21st century. So Remember, when we talk about these stories from Samuel, we are in the territory of DTRH, the Deuteronomic historian. These stories are not there to factually record the history. They are there to instruct the future about what to do and what not to do. And David's story is very much a story of what happens when you are faithful and how things fall apart when you are not faithful. One of the things that really struck me in my reading this time of Samuel, besides the connection to Arthur that we're going to get to later, is that these are not really stories of God's action in David's world. These are very much stories of David's action in God's world, and God sort of takes a back seat. If you've ever heard me say before that some of the Bible is national history, ooh, that really applies to these David stories. These stories are their theological history through DTRH, but they're also, as we've talked about before, sort of royal propaganda for King David. So we can see both the character foils going on between Eli and Samuel and David and Saul, and we can see the apologetic work, or that work of explaining to a potentially hostile audience what is going on to make them more able to listen to our version of the story, particularly in the matter of succession, because of course, under classic monarchy rules, it should have been one of Saul's kids that took over. David, though, becomes Saul's son-in-law, and when they talk to each other in the Bible, they often call each other father and son, which is sort of a way for DTRH to set up the legitimacy of the succession from Saul to David. Also, we see a lot of discussion in 2 Samuel of the deaths of these key figures, including Saul's death, and explanations of how it wasn't David, it was this other guy. So you're going to notice that when you go and read 2 Samuel, we seem to be talking a lot about some murders that happened of people around David, and David was not the murderer. He was definitely not the murderer. It's apologetic work. So when we think of King David and what we know about him, I was really struck in my reading this week of how much King David sounds a lot like King Arthur. We have a king who starts with humble beginnings. He's a simple shepherd boy. All of his brothers are passed over for him to be selected. We have this massive moment where David does something heroic. He doesn't pull a sword from the stone, but he kills Goliath with a slingshot and a rock. Then he picks up Goliath's sword, and it is a sword like none other, giving it a parallel to King Arthur's Excalibur. He led justly. We hear several times in the scripture about how his policies were more fair. It wasn't exactly a round table, but his soldiers and the people who worked around him seemed to love David. And so did the people, particularly when he was out dancing in the street. Well, everyone except his wife, Michal, who thought that was just shameful. David put Judah on the map. If you remember back to the first episode when we talked about how relatively unimportant the Israelites and Canaanites were in the 12th century BCE, all of a sudden, Judah's a power player. Judah's such a power player that Israel gets in on the deal and wants to be part of the same nation. And we see the transition from pagan to faithful Jewish religion, just like we saw with Arthur from more pagan religion to Christianity. We see David move things, right? The northern king, his name was Ishbaal. I mean, that is a super Canaanite deity mashup of a name. It's the most ridiculous mashup Canaanite deity name you could think of, pretty much. And so then we transition to David, chosen of God and more faithful practice. This is DTRH singing the song. A fidelity issue is the beginning of the end of things, just like it was with Guinevere and Lancelot and Arthur. There is the story of David and Bathsheba and Uriah the Hittite, and that story with all its poor ethics, that's sort of the beginning of the end. There's also this issue of incest in the story of King Arthur. I don't think I put that on the notes, but with his potential incest with his sister. And in the story of King David, you've got Amnon's rape of his half-sister Tamar. We have the constant presence of Nathan or Samuel, just like we have the constant presence of Merlin in the story. And we even have, if you remember back to 1 Samuel 28, that key moment where Samuel rises from the dead at a critical moment and predicts that Saul and his sons are going to die the next day. Just like Arthur had the experience of Merlin rising at a necessary moment. Like Arthur, David's kingdom, after the beginning of the end with the issue of infidelity, starts a slow disintegration and seems to lose the favor of God, leading him up to a point where he's so impotent in all things that we even make a point of putting a beautiful virgin in his bed and commenting on his impotence. He has an uprising by his son Absalom, just like Arthur had an uprising by Mordred, who was his son or his nephew. And at the end, we have the messianic hope. It's not the same as with Arthur because, of course, they're waiting for Arthur to come back. But in this story, we are waiting for someone of David's line, the true king who will lead them all, who in this case will be Jesus Christ. Do I think that the David story was stolen from Arthur? That'd be really weird because the David story was written so much earlier than the story of Arthur. It could be that the development of the Arthurian legend was based on 1st and 2nd Samuel, or Chronicles, which is pretty much like a rewrite of 2nd Samuel. But more likely, what we see in David is the beginning of this paradigm of a heroic king, a legendary king, a king who unites all the foreign people, all of the people of the area, battles off the enemies, and does things justly and fairly. It's interesting, isn't it? And just like David becomes the standard by which future kings of Israel and Judah are judged. Think about this. We talked about Camelot, Arthur's court, when John F. Kennedy was in power, right? Here we've got a beautiful first lady. She's restoring the history of the White House. They're traveling all over and charming the world. It looks beautiful. It looks wonderful. We called it Camelot. So in the same way, you have that story of Arthur, that legend of this good court raised up as the paradigm for what courts should look like. Except in our case, of course, it's not really monarchy, is it? Might have felt that way. So I think those are interesting parallels, and I hope they help you think about David. Please go ahead and read anywhere in 2 Samuel that you'd like. Some of the stories are gory. Some of the stories are very much national history. A few of them mention God. But you're not going to find a ton of spiritual edification in 2 Samuel. What you're going to find is the story of a king who rose and a king who fell, a king who was faithful and a king who was very, very human and made huge mistakes. All of those things, still the king, still the important king that God loved enough to continue his line all the way through to Jesus Christ. Next time you see me in episode 4, I will be talking about Solomon, the king who came after David. And I look forward to seeing you then.